So in 1968, students worldwide protested against capitalism, the economic and political elite, and the Vietnam War. And in this context, as you probably know, the 5 students initiated the first symposium to start cross-generational dialogue. 50 years later, what are the topics that 2 generations are discussing the most right now from your personal point of view?
Well, no doubt climate change, and of course I'm close to it because of the industry that I'm in, and therefore I'm more exposed to it. But I think even if I try to step back and be objective and see what is happening in society, I do think climate change, the energy transition, is probably one of the most discussed topics. The other thing I would say is general equity in society, whether this is gender equality, racial equality, whether it is the freedom of ideas. I think this is another really big thing at this point in time. And I think for me, they also sound like the right topics.
Mm-hmm. And what does cross-generational dialogue mean to you?
Practically speaking, it means discussion with my children. I have 4 of them in different age brackets, and I can tell you the discussion with the 26-year-old is a whole lot easier than the discussion with the 16-year-old, and that is because the younger generations have even more critical attitudes, and much younger in their life and tenure feel this pressure and exposure to the challenges of the future. But I think also in other ways, we of course have a very significant amount of young people in the company who want to understand not only what the direction of the company is, but also can we change this and what is my role in it, and even very actively challenge, well, if you don't change X or Z or whatever, I may not want to work for this company. So it is intergenerational dialogue. It's not an abstract concept for me at all. It is really there every day.
And as you have mentioned earlier, the climate change is especially affecting the younger generations. Do you think that that the relationship between the different generations is suffering from this right now?
It's a good question. I would probably be tempted to say yes to that, and much more so looking at it through the eyes of the younger generation, which is only natural, of course, because they have the challenges still ahead of them. I do think and I do detect that there is limited patience, but also limited trust from the younger generation with the older generation. Of course, it's probably fair to say that the older generation sometimes feels that some of the ideas are impractical or maybe overblown or whatever else as a problem. But I think that problem is actually receding. I think also the older generation is probably finding that there is more of a crisis perhaps than they maybe thought a few years ago. So I think the gap is not necessarily bridging, but I would imagine the challenges are much more so there for the younger generation, the older generation.
And what can we do to improve this relationship, like to get closer again?
That's also a very difficult one, of course. I do think, of course, dialogue will help, but I would also say more participation across the generations. I think in my industry we talk a lot about accountability and who does what, etc. There is no way that somebody joining my company today would have the same type of sort of initial work experiences as I had, which was basically work in a team you do as you have been told. They want to participate, if possible, within the corporate strategy. And I think while some of that may be impractical, I think we should find ways and means to allow for that. I think the pandemic hasn't helped in many ways. I think before the pandemic, it was more common for me to meet up with small groups of young people and say, well, what do you think about the strategy? And more often than not, I got new ideas rather than to just explain to them what I was thinking. And I think we can do more of that again. And the expectations that more of that should happen are very clearly there too. And then I think the other way we have to improve is by actually showing that we can make progress. I think part of the problem of the intergenerational conflict, if you want to use that word, is there is also absence of progress, and that actually drives this disagreement even more so. Maybe going back to the 60s as well, there was also in a way absence of progress.
And last year, a court ordered Shell to adjust its climate targets. Several environmental NGOs had filed a lawsuit against the company. Is it too late to collaboration between like NGOs and Shell, or can we do something about it?
It depends a little bit. I think we collaborate tremendously well with many NGOs that really help us, that give us new insights, that we use as advisors and everything else. Then there's also campaigning NGOs who have also a function in society, of course, which is to mobilize public opinion and mobilize society, which I would also agree with, but that is Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, etc. But there I think the collaboration is more difficult. Not because we wouldn't want to, but basically because they don't think that is their business model to collaborate with us. Their business model is to disagree with us. And then we have to have a different relationship in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, I think you said that even if Shell stopped selling oil and gas immediately, someone else would sell it and the demand wouldn't change. And my question is, thinking about climate change, do we need to approach the challenge from the supply side rather, or the demand side?
That's a very good question. And I think it needs to be done from both. And I think for a long time, people have had a very simple view that if you change supply, then things will change. It's also more easily pointed out, of course, where does this come from? It comes from the ground, or it comes from a pipe, or it comes from a plant. So it is easier to point where the supply comes from and how it needs to change. But you cannot sufficiently make change if you only work on the supply side. Ultimately, we have to work at least as much, if not a little bit more, on the demand side as well. Because indeed, if we were to stop selling petrol today, it's a supply side measure, I don't think people will say, oh, now that I can't fill up my car at Shell anymore, I better buy an electric car. Something else will happen. So we have to work on the demand side equation as well. And I think also there, we have a role to play. We have to work with customers and where possible also with governments to find out how we can reform demand in the economy for greener products that I'm very happy to supply, by the way. But quite often, of course, they need a little bit of a helping hand, certainly in the early years.
Mm-hmm. And when you became a CEO, you attracted quite some attention with some statements, also when you welcomed like the ban of diesel and gasoline engines, for example. Is it possible to be the CEO of one of the biggest oil companies and also still be committed to environmental protection?
It depends how you define what a company is all about. You say oil company. I like to think of ourselves as an energy transition company. So we don't do oil, we also do other energy forms. And actually our mission is to provide more and cleaner energy solutions. So if you think of yourself as that type of company, then of course it's entirely logical that you just try to accelerate the transition where we believe there's actually more value to be had in society. And yes, I did speak out to the horror of some of my industry compatriots that we should ban the ICE cars in places like the UK and Europe, and since then said it should be done earlier. Because I think, again, that's the only way we are going to change the emissions associated with mobility. To just say you can also, if you wanted to, put electricity in your car, is just not going to do it. We have to have government interventions that need to be supported by companies like us.